Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Bwlb Season 2. I'm delighted that you're joining us. Over the season, we're getting into the detail behind some of the really big issues that are critical to the way that we manage our water and more broadly our environment. We're speaking to leading figures in the environment sector around the world and practitioners, many of whom are Bwlb members who are making a difference every day through their work. We're grateful to our series sponsor, Thames Water, whose support across this full season means that we can share these conversations with you. I'm Niki Roach, and Let's Talk Bwlb is a Bwlb podcast. I think one of Bwlb's real strengths is the breadth of the topics that our members have expertise in and the depth of that expertise, and we'll be shining a light on both of those over this series. The theme of my presidency was Everything is Connected, and I hope through this podcast and across the rest of the season you'll spot the links, environmental, social and personal, between the topics that we're covering and how they might relate to you. We've got a fantastic interview coming up in a moment with Beccy Speight, Chief Executive of the RSPB. But before we hear from Beccy, I'm joined by another fantastic co-host, Emma Howard-Boyd. Welcome, Emma. I'm really pleased that you could join us.
Great to be with you today.
Emma is the chair of the Environment Agency here in England and Wales, the environmental regulator, and she's also a global ambassador for Race to Resilience and Race to Zero. Additionally, she holds a number of advisory and board roles, including interim chair for the Green Finance Institute and is a board member of the European Climate Foundation and UK Board of Trade. So it's a great pleasure to have you as my co-host as we navigate today's topic of nature-based solutions. As usual, Emma and I are going to listen to our guest interview together in a moment, and then we'll discuss Emma's reflections. Our guest interview today is with Beccy Speight, the CEO of RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Beccy's a passionate environmentalist. She was formerly the Chief Executive of the Woodland Trust here in the UK and has also held roles with the National Trust. We all know the importance of taking a break, and I actually recorded this interview while doing just that in beautiful Pembrokeshire a little earlier this year, so you'll notice it's a bit echoey and you might even hear the sea in the background. Beccy's personal and professional passion for this topic comes through, and I was really interested to hear her thoughts on how often we try to look for really simple solutions, yet the reality of needing multi-benefit outcomes means that's not always possible.
The human species likes to simplify things. Obviously, we like to think climate change, right, what can we do? I know, let's plant trees. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, because if in fact we end up planting, for example, lots and lots of monocultures of Sitka spruce, which we might decide to do for timber production, and if we only do that, then that's actually not solving the climate issue, because native species actually sequester carbon more successfully over a longer period of time because they're not on that rotational felling and therefore damaging the soils underneath them. And we also know that it's better for nature to have more of that kind of native woodland, and that helps retain these intact ecosystems and restore these intact ecosystems that we need in terms of all of those other multiple benefits.
So, Emma, before we head to our interview with Beccy, can you start by telling us what the Environment Agency's thoughts on nature-based solutions are?
Nature-based solutions for the Environment Agency have a role to play in our regulatory work, but also in the work that we do delivering England's flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. And it chimes really well with a visit that I did last week to Dartmoor to look at some of the nature-based solutions that we have been putting in place in gullies around Buckfast as part of our flood alleviation scheme. And as I walked around with colleagues, seeing what we've been doing, learning how we've been working with our partners, it really brought to life what Beccy was saying in terms of the collaboration that we need.
Perfect. Well, it's a great opener and it gives us a real feel for what nature-based solutions look and feel like on the ground. Thank you. Let's get stuck into the interview with Beccy. To the uninitiated, what do we mean by nature-based solutions?
I would say that nature-based solutions are all about how we address social changes, societal challenges, if you like, whilst providing benefits for human beings and for biodiversity. So they're multi-benefit solutions, if you like, and they're very cost-effective as well in the long term. The reason they're so important is that they address these two big challenges that we have. So we have the climate crisis, and we know all about that. And we also have the nature crisis. So, the State of Nature report, which is a big multi-agency body report that we help produce every few years. The most recent one of those in 2019 showed that 41% of our species just in the UK are in decline. and 15% are at risk of extinction. So we have two crises on our hands, and they're very interlinked. If you like, they're sort of two sides almost of the same coin. And nature-based solutions are something that can help us address both.
That's pretty stark, isn't it? So, I mean, if we thought about this globally rather than from the UK context for a second, how much of a solution to the climate and the kind of ecological crisis can nature-based solutions be?
In terms of nature, one of the biggest threats to nature is climate change, human-induced climate change. So obviously doing anything to tackle climate change and doing it in the right way that also benefits nature will have a good news story for nature. In terms of climate, I think it's really important that we're clear that we have to reduce our fossil fuel emissions. So it can't be a replacement for doing that really important piece. But in terms of allowing us to do some of that reduction and allowing us to adapt to the changes that climate change is inevitably going to bring now, then nature-based solutions have a really important part to play in that.
And if we thought about practical examples of where you've seen them working well, can you give me a feel for what it looks like in practice?
So globally, it's one of the reasons why people like me get so obsessed about things like the Amazon, about things like protecting our existing boreal forests around the world, the Everglades down in Florida, trying to protect those from damage and destruction. That's globally the picture. So there's a big piece we can play. And I think it's important to say that with nature-based solutions, protection is the most important thing we can do, first of all, to hang on to those intact or almost intact ecosystems that we have already. But beyond that, we can then restore, we can fix what's been damaged already, and we can also create new as well to a certain extent. So that doing things in that order is really important. That's important globally as well as in the UK. And if you just take one example in the UK, so we often talk about trees in the UK, but actually our peatlands are incredibly important, as are other habitats as well. But if you take our peatlands at the moment, they're emitting about 5% of our greenhouse gas emissions because they are in such a poor state. So they're actually increasing the problem rather than being able to mitigate it and indeed allow us to adapt to the changes that climate change are going to bring. So fixing our peatlands, re-wetting our upland peat and stopping destroying our lowland peat could make a huge difference in terms of our mitigation and our adaptation here in the UK. And that's just one example of a habitat. But you can also talk about woodlands. You can also talk about things like salt marsh, about permanent grassland. They all have a role to play. And if we can just protect what we have, restore what's been damaged and look at how we create more, then they can definitely make a big contribution in terms of both mitigation and adaptation as well.
That's such clear messaging, isn't it? Protect, restore, and then create if you need it. So you can hear the passion in your voice, and I get it. What are RSPB doing in this space at the moment?
And I guess you could say, why are we even interested in this space? Well, it's because we basically want to see a world that is richer in nature, richer in wildlife, where people live in harmony with it. And nature-based solutions are right in that space, because we know that, for example, if we were able to protect and restore our peatlands more effectively, then that's really good for the wildlife that need that habitat. So, things like curlew, plover, those upland birds would really benefit from not having very dried out upland peat, which is the situation. I mean, I live not far from the Peak District, and when you walk on the tops of the Peak District, you're looking at really damaged, degraded upland peat. So restoring that, re-wetting it, would have huge benefits in terms of nature, as well as being able to hold water in the system and mitigating that flood risk we're going to get from these sudden downpours. We're going to get more and more off frequently, causing flooding downstream. So, just being able to kind of look at those multi-benefit solutions, it's such a big win. It's such an obvious win in a way. But because I think it happens over a longer time period, and because you have to make the investment now to see that economic return further down the line, it's a more complex solution for society to grapple with and for politicians to back sufficiently, which they're not doing at the moment.
If it's so obvious, then what's stopping us moving forward with this approach right now? And you've touched on perhaps part of the answer there, which is that it's complicated. But give me a feel for what else is making this difficult to implement more broadly.
Some progress has been made. So there is more funding coming forward from the UK government now for things like some peatland restoration, some woodland creation. We've seen funding for that come through just in the last year. I would say it's not sufficient. So I think those nature-based solutions can contribute far more. And there's been a lot of work done looking at the economic benefits that can come for implementing some of those nature-based solutions. And it's very obvious to see now. So I think further investment, doing it more at scale is important. But it's really complicated. So we're basically moving from a situation when we've tended to treat a lot of our land, for example, as kind of monocultures. We tended to think that piece of land does one thing for us, and it might be intensive farming, for example, or it might be intensive forestry, or it might be a heather upland for shooting, for example. We've tended to kind of put things in boxes. And actually what this is all about is saying, land needs to do so much more for us. It needs to deliver these multi-benefits, and that means we need to think about it in a more complex way. The human species likes to simplify things. Obviously, we like to think climate change, right, what can we do? I know, let's plant trees. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, because if in fact we end up planting, for example, lots and lots of monocultures of Sitka spruce, which we might decide to do for timber production, and if we only do that, then that's actually not solving the climate issue, because native species actually sequester carbon more successfully over a longer period of time, because they're not on that rotational felling and therefore damaging the soils underneath them. And we also know that it's better for nature to have more of that kind of native woodland, and that helps retain these intact ecosystems and restore these intact ecosystems that we need in terms of all of those other multiple benefits. So it's a much more complex issue than I think we like to think, and we need to think about it in that way. And I think that's very off-putting often for politicians. They want a simple answer. They want to be able to say, we are going to plant X number of trees. Simple, count them, there you go. And actually it's much more complicated than that. So one of the things I'm really keen on is that politicians in particular, who are making a lot of these decisions at the moment, really educate themselves around this area, and treat their knowledge of this area as being as important as their knowledge of how the economy works or their knowledge of how some of our social care systems work. They really need to get up to speed on this, because the decisions we make in the next decade are absolutely fundamental to us being able to adapt to climate change, which is the thing that the Climate Change Committee has really talked about this week, but also to do all the mitigation that we need to do now to try and limit the damage that's going to come from climate change going forward, and deal with that nature crisis that I talked about as well. A lot of our species are right on the brink, and if we make the right decisions and do the right things now, then we can really make a difference.
This series of Let's Talk WEM is sponsored by Thames Water, and it's thanks to their support that it's possible to bring this podcast to you. If your organisation would like to find out more about sponsoring an episode in this series, or even a future series of Let's Talk WEM, just go to letstalkwem.sciwem.org to get all the information you need. So if you could wave your magic nature-based solution wand in that case then, and make some of those right decisions, what would they be?
The thing I can tell you about is what we have learnt at the RSPB about this, and what we think we need more of, basically. So in our uplands, we've got places like Dovestone and Haweswater, which we've worked on with United Utilities, who are the landowner. And that's where we've done upland peat restoration, re-wetting of peat, re-wiggling of river systems and so on, and been able to deliver those multiple benefits both for communities and for nature. And then if you think about things like tree planting, we've been able to do some of that and allow actual natural regeneration of trees. So it's not always about sticking new trees in the ground. You can just allow woodland to naturally regenerate in some places where you've got a seed source. And then we've also done a lot of what I would call more adaptation work, which has been about coastal realignment in particular. So thinking about places like Wallasey down on the south coast, or Medmerry, where we've actually, as the threat of coastal flooding has grown and grown for those communities, we've been able to work with partners like the Environment Agency, move those existing flood defences further inland, and actually create new intertidal habitat which can deal with the heightened flooding risk, but also replaces we've lost huge amounts of kind of intertidal habitat over the last 50 years. So it replaces some of that and allows the species that need that kind of habitat to thrive again. So again, it's this kind of a win-win solution. But really, again, big, complicated projects. So if you think about something like Wallasey, that used the spoil from Crossrail, for example, to create that new intertidal habitat. And it's that kind of ambition and that kind of scale that we need to be thinking about. And we've certainly done a piece of work ourselves called Shifting Shores, which looked at where else you could do that kind of coastal realignment work. There are loads of opportunities around the UK, so it's about money and it's about political will to make that happen.
And it sounds like whilst those projects are complex, actually they're individual pieces of work. And actually what I'm hearing, I think, is where's the broader vision for nature-based solutions? And as you talked about, that political will, and where does that sit? Because when things are complicated, I mean, gosh, the listeners will know the theme of my presidency is everything is connected for that exact reason. And it's so obvious, but it's really flipping difficult, isn't it? You know, if we've got policymakers listening, for example, then is it policy? Is there a space to do more in the world of policy to try and create this kind of vision? Do you think the Environment Bill in the UK is going to help? Leave us not feeling too sad about the future, Becky. Try and help.
No, so I think all of those things, actually. So I think one is kind of understanding the science and doing the mapping work. And so thinking about these problems from a large scale spatial perspective. So at the RSPB, we mapped where carbon and nature was most intense in terms of the UK and found those areas, and 60+% of it was in poor condition. So knowing where those places are, where we could make most difference, both for the carbon situation and for the nature situation, is really important. And then applying policy to make sure we can kind of deliver those solutions. I think also just joining up agriculture, clearly the kind of agriculture we want to incentivise going forward with policy and with funding is so important, and why, you know, the new ELM scheme, environmental land management scheme that's being introduced in England, getting that right is really, really important, because obviously so much carbon is locked up in our soils. So the way in which we manage our soils and the way in which we farm, both for carbon and nature, is going to be incredibly important. And then you mentioned the Environment Bill, and, you know, one of the things we're certainly really pushing for at the moment is that we have a really clear target that is legally binding in that Environment Bill about halting species decline. And unless we set ourselves those clear binding targets, things like the Climate Act have shown us, we will not progress. So making sure we have those legally binding frameworks is incredibly important in keeping us on the right trajectory. And why things like, you know, the recent furore over the UK-Australia trade deal, for example, that really matters, because that sends signals to farming about the kind of vision we have for the kind of agriculture we want to see. So we have to get things joined up across government and all pushing in the same direction for, you know, a net zero world, which is what we've said we want to see by 2050, but also for a nature positive world, because, you know, we could make progress towards this net zero world in the wrong way, and that would mean that we've got a less nature positive world, and therefore the ecosystems on which we all depend for clean air, water, food will be destroyed along the way. So we have to get both moving together in the right direction, and that's the space that I think nature-based solutions absolutely sit in, and the policy and legislative framework around that is really important.
We would absolutely agree. You know, from a SIREN perspective, we declared a climate and ecological emergency for exactly that reason. It's got to be both, hasn't it? Because what are we going to be left with if we just look at climate change without thinking about the nature element? So on a personal level, why is this so important to you? You spent your career working in and around this space, and you're obviously really passionate about it. So tell me a little bit about why this is something that's so important to you individually.
Well, I think globally, and also kind of in UK terms, this is our generation's fight. It's our generation's massive challenge. You know, each generation, I think, has something that is its contribution to make to the future of the world and the future of humankind. And I think this is it for us. So we have to be able to step up into that space and make the difference we need to make. And it is time limited, you know, so that's what I can't emphasise enough, I suppose, is the urgency. So I kind of feel the hot breath of the climate and nature emergency breathing down my neck every morning when I wake up, because now is the time when we have to make the right decisions and get the right trajectories set. So that's the first thing, I suppose, from a sort of a grandiose kind of, you know, overall viewpoint. But for me personally, I was very lucky. I had a very kind of nature intense childhood where I was out and about in the natural world. It brings huge benefits to me personally in terms of my kind of health and well-being. I just think it has an intrinsic moral value that we as a species need to step into the right space on. So those two things for me, it's the hot breath breathing down the back of my neck in terms of our generation, but it's also about just the sheer pleasure and joy it brings to me to know that we have a world in which we are appreciative and glory in what nature can bring to us.
Oh, it's joyful, Becky, I feel really similar. I was just reflecting. I'm sat here today recording this podcast from the beautiful Pembrokeshire coast in Wales, as opposed to my spare bedroom in Leeds normally. And there is something utterly uplifting, isn't there, about just being able to, be in the environment in a way that these kind of spaces allows.
The very thought that if we continue on the trajectory we are on now without doing something about it, the very thought that your kids and your kids' kids might not have that in their lives, I think is utterly sort of soul destroying, really. And we can do something about it. We know what we need to do. We just need to blinking well crack on with it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Our time is running painfully short, so sprinkle a few seeds of optimism in for us to think about as we move forward.
I'm definitely an optimist about this. I think we can do the right stuff. So number one, I think we know what we need to do. So the examples I've given you, and those are just from the RSPB, there are lots and lots of other individuals and organisations and academics, all of whom can help us design the solutions we need to put into place, put these nature-based solutions at scale into our trajectory. So we know what we need to do. I think political will is changing. There are signals coming through that politicians are understanding this more, that they are taking it more seriously. But by golly, we have to crack on with that. I worry that it will be too little too late if we're not careful. I think finally, the thing that has absolutely made me more optimistic this year is that I think the COVID pandemic, the experience of lockdown just for the general public, has been a time when they have really appreciated the joy of nature on their doorsteps and what it has meant for them as individuals. And I think opening the kind of invisible doorway from that to being able to provide the public will to get these nature-based solutions happening is something that organisations like mine can really help with. And I think people are increasingly realising that we have to tackle this. And I think at the end of the day, it will be people pressure that will cause the political conditions of success to change and cause that kind of systemic change that we need around things like agriculture and economics and forestry. And at the same time, I see people being very willing to change what they are doing in their own lives and think about how their gardens are more wildlife friendly, or how they join a group that does work in public green spaces in their area. So I think that wave of support is really building, and that is the thing that will deliver this world richer in nature for us and deliver the nature-based solutions that we need to be able to not only mitigate climate change but adapt to it as well.
Okay, Emma, so we've heard from Becky. What did you think?
Well, I hugely respect the work that Becky is doing at the RSPB and the range of different solutions that nature can bring to the climate emergency. So whether it's locking in carbon through tree planting, restoring peatland, managing soils, wetlands and salt marsh, or indeed the work that we are doing in partnership with others, including the RSPB, around resilience to flood risk. She really brings the variety of ways that nature needs to be both restored, but also in restoring nature, we can see solutions to the environment and nature crisis.
So what fills you, both personally and professionally, with a kind of sense of excitement for nature-based solutions? Where are you optimistic?
Well, again, if I go back to the visit that I did last week on Dartmoor, the practical action that we can take out in nature to provide solutions to flooding, but also the multiple benefits as well. So in addition to holding back water, there are places around the country where we can also restore things, clean things, and make the most of what nature can provide us as a service towards us, but also the joy of just being outside and appreciating nature as well. So whilst very excited to see how much nature can help us, also quite alarmed, maybe anxious at the pace that we now need to act, and also that acknowledgement of how we have let nature decline over many years.
Yeah, I think anxiety is a great word to use there, actually. I think a lot of listeners will feel something similar. So if we just touch on that for a second, where do you wish we could move faster?
For me, it's in the delivery of real solutions. There's no doubt that as we head into COP26, as we prepare for the biodiversity COP15, that there is ever more attention being placed on both the climate and the nature emergency. But for me, it's that translating of all the good words, all the rhetoric, into real action on the ground. And I think sometimes collectively we are waiting for the perfect solution before we get on and start acting. I think another area that concerns me is how much we collectively as a society in this country, in other countries around the world, are prepared to pay for the environment, the natural environment that we want and deserve. And I think that is a conversation that needs to be had across all groups, whether they are private, public, or indeed third sector organisations, to really understand how we properly value the natural environment.
So you have a role, obviously, with the Green Finance Institute. I would be keen to explore where you see finance being an enabler.
So there's much greater recognition about the value and importance of the natural environment. And I think nobody said it more eloquently than David Attenborough at an event I attended probably 18 months ago at the Guildhall at the launch of the COP26 finance programme, where I'm paraphrasing, but basically he was saying that whilst not an expert in finance, he is an expert in the natural environment, and talking to the leaders of many different financial institutions, he was saying that if you're relying on the natural environment to be stable as part of your investment strategy, then perhaps you need to think again. So at the Environment Agency, we've been looking at how we can start crowding in private sector funding, working with DEFRA, working with other partners like the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, Triodos Bank, to look at specific projects where we can start to see the values, to start to see the cash flow that can arise from nature-based solutions. And the Green Finance Institute, which I am currently interim chair, is also working with others in terms of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, a sister initiative to TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, because that's another area that we need to look at, but also looking at the role that finance can play in raising money for nature-based solutions. I think across all of this work, huge recognition that you can't do it alone, that you have to bring in investors, policymakers, regulators, corporates, and really understand the interventions that need to take place, but also the importance of delivery at a local level, and therefore perhaps how you bring smaller projects together in a way that they can be scaled up or brought together in a way that large investors can also over time contribute to.
And do you think that our regulatory framework, of which you will be massively familiar, is an enabler to bringing things like green finance into the sector?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think there's no doubt that working closely with Ofwat, the economic regulator, if we look at water investment, the Environment Agency working with Ofwat and the water companies is now earmarking more investment around the environment. But actually, as we're still at the start of the decade of delivery, the decade of decisive action around climate and nature's recovery, we need to perhaps look at how we speed up how we work together to introduce the right kind of regulatory change that allows those companies that are very progressive and want to do the right thing to invest differently. There's no doubt that investors, companies follow the money, but equally we need to make sure that the regulatory framework allows the best to happen, but also can capture the things that are not going as we like them to go. I've said in the past that I'd like to see the environmental regulators work more closely, perhaps in lockstep with the economic regulators, in lockstep with the financial regulators. So making sure that we're not keeping the environment and nature in a separate bucket, that all three types of regulatory bodies are working very much together.
When we think about a more circular economy, then arguably all of the flows, natural and finance and economic, all need to work together, and we need to make sure there's obviously regulation. So I think to hear that feels like that's certainly an aspirational direction of travel is wonderful. If we move on to kind of COP26, obviously it's a hot topic. We're nearly there, November this year in Glasgow. What do you hope to see from COP26?
Well, there's a huge amount pinning on the success of COP26. For me, I'd very much like to see the importance of preparing for climate shocks, the adaptation and resilience agenda come very much to the fore. Certainly that's where I've been putting a lot of my effort over recent years as part of the Global Commission on Adaptation, and now as one of the champions for the race to resilience alongside the race to zero. So how we can provide finance and methodologies to allow the whole world to prepare for climate shocks. And certainly the weather that we have been experiencing around the world has drawn the adaptation and resilience agenda to the attention of many global leaders, whereas in the past this is often felt like something that is affecting developing countries more. Certainly we've seen more and more events, whether it's too much water, too little water, too hot, fires, and indeed in some instances too cold, really show how much shock there is in the system already from the climate change agenda. And then that link to nature as well. So great to see that nature is playing a strong part in the various days that COP is focusing on. Similarly, finance, recognising that it's not just governments that need to fund, whether it's transition strategies or preparing for climate shocks, adaptation strategies. This is the whole world and all sectors getting ready for what we're already seeing locked in.
And how hopeful are you that COP will deliver what you're wanting from it, do you think, Emma?
I think at the moment I am hopeful that we will continue to see the action that is required. That's where I get my hope from. The range of different individuals, companies, governments, acknowledging that we all need to act and that this is a continual process. And I think from that action that we're all beginning to take, that's where hope springs.
If there is one final takeaway from what we've discussed today that you'd want listeners to reflect on, what would that be?
I think it is to think about the action you can take, not by 2050, not even by 2030, but the action that you can take today. Every decision we make, whether it's a personal one or a professional one, in my view, needs to be thought through the climate and nature recovery lens. And we can all get out there and do things at an individual level, but the more we're pushing in the same direction, the more we will achieve the change that we'd like to see.
Making our voices heard is really important, isn't it? And finding ways to do that and translating ideas into action is absolutely something I'm supportive of. So as usual, we could always carry on, but we need to stop there. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to both Beccy Speight and Emma Howard-Boyd today. Don't forget to subscribe to the pod on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode. And I'm really looking forward to sharing the rest of the season with you. So all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to Beccy Speight and my wonderful co-host, Emma Howard-Boyd. Thank you, Emma.
Lovely to be with you today, Niki.
That's it, everyone. Stay safe. See you next time.
Let's Talk Bwlb is produced by Bwlb. Bwlb Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.